Clarice Beaufort was not an ordinary woman.
At 42, she had overcome the toughest obstacles with fierce determination, and her name was now synonymous with rigor and justice within the judiciary. She was not just a judge. She was Chief Judge of the State's Court of Appeals, one of the highest offices a black woman could hope to achieve in a world where the majority of faces in courtrooms were white and privileged. His career had been built on principles of egalitarian justice, but also on unfailing resilience in the face of adversity. Born in a working-class neighborhood, Clarice was raised by a mother who taught her from a young age that no goal was too big for her. Never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot be, her mother, a teacher, told her, encouraging her to excel in every field she took up. But even with such support, Clarice knew that her skin color was always going to be a determining factor in her interactions with the outside world. Society, even modern, still often treated him unfairly. From her early years at university, where she had been the only black woman in her law class, to her years of practice as a lawyer, Clarice had always had to work twice as hard to prove her worth. When she became a judge, this fight for recognition did not stop. Every decision she made was scrutinized, sometimes under a microscope, often with skepticism, even condescension, from those who questioned whether a black person, a woman, could really be fit for such responsibility. But Clarice never let herself be defeated. His independence of mind and his confidence in his own expertise silenced the doubts that could emanate from more conservative circles traditionally dominated by white men. The respect she commanded in legal circles was undeniable, but sometimes she was confronted with a more insidious form of racism, which manifested itself in condescending attitudes or furtive gestures, barely perceptible, but present enough to remind Clarice that she was never completely safe. She was not yet completely accepted into high society, even with her prestigious title. For many, she remained above all black, in a world where influence and authority were traditionally attributed to white people. Every time she entered a room, the looks became heavier, more curious, sometimes suspicious. And Clarice, with her confidence and calm, knew that this reality was part of her fight. That morning, before diving into the frenzy of the court, Clarice had decided to take a moment for herself. She lived in a peaceful neighborhood, one of those neighborhoods where the streets are lined with majestic oak trees and the houses are made of red brick and white stone. Trimmed gardens, perfect driveways, and luxury cars that gleamed in the morning sun. It was a neighborhood where the appearance of wealth and privilege was evident on every street corner. A place where everything seemed orderly and clean, a little too smooth sometimes, like a decor that is too perfect. And despite her position, Clarice could not ignore that. Often, in this idyllic setting, she was a stranger, a living reminder that all this luxury and opulence was not intended for her. As she crossed the main street, she felt a few eyes on her. She recognized those looks. Furtive glances, sometimes contemptuous, often curious. Some people stared at her as if her mere presence here was incongruous. Clarice knew that many of them were wondering why a black woman was in such a neighborhood. They did not understand that although she had her place here as a citizen and a judge, the history of her being here was different from theirs. She wasn't born with a prestigious name or a fortune behind her, but through hard work she had worked her way to the top, and yet she still sometimes felt stared down by these little invisible discriminations that pierced everyday life. The sound of her phone vibrated in her purse and broke her thoughts. It was a message from his secretary, telling him that an important audience was waiting for him in a few hours. A complex matter, in which she would have to demonstrate all her wisdom and impartiality. The kind of affair where every decision would be dissected by his peers, and where the public's attention would be focused on his every move. She put her phone in her bag and, for a moment, breathed deeply in the fresh morning air. This simple moment of tranquility had become a breath of fresh air in his busy schedule. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts wander, preparing to plunge back into the tumult of the court, where every decision made irreversibly affected lives. But that morning, destiny had other plans for her. Officer DuPont, a white police officer in his 50s, patrolled the neighborhood with the attitude of someone who believed he had unquestioned authority. His movements were quick, almost nervous, as if he were constantly trying to prove something to himself and to the world. His uniform seemed too big for him, his police badge gleamed in the sunlight, almost like a symbol of absolute power. He was an impulsive man, known for his propensity to judge others by their appearance, a habit which, over the years, had left his career marked by recurring allegations of racist behavior. Few people dared to stand up against him, and those who tried often found themselves in an awkward position, either intimidated or silenced by his reputation for verbal brutality and contempt. Seeing Clarice walking alone, he was quick to observe her with an almost palpable insistence. His eyes traveled over her face, searching for the slightest flaw in her expression, before settling on her body, as if it could be a clue to her legitimacy to be in this neighborhood. What especially caught his attention was his outfit: an elegant wool jacket, neat pants, and a confident walk. She appeared to be a businesswoman, and Dupont, in his mind, struggled to reconcile this image with that of a black woman in a neighborhood he considered reserved for the most privileged. To him, it just didn't make sense. Without hesitation, he turned his vehicle around and abruptly parked on the side of the street, temporarily blocking traffic. As he leaves, his gaze hardens, the hostility already palpable. His steps were heavy and measured, as if he was preparing to impose his presence. Arriving alongside Clarice, he addressed her in a dry tone, the one he reserved for situations where he intended to dominate. "Excuse me, madam, do you have a reason for being in this neighborhood?" Clarice stopped abruptly, surprised by the question. She hadn't seen anything that could put her in danger, until this very moment. "I live here." "Why this question?" she replied, her voice calm but tinged with obvious perplexity. She knew this situation was a test, an examination of his patience and calmness, but she didn't expect him to react this way. Dupont, without looking away from her face, was more aggressive, his words full of condescension. "I have my doubts. You know, people like you. You don't really belong in this kind of neighborhood. I'm going to need your papers." Clarice, although destabilized by the man's insolence, felt a surge of indignation in her stomach. But she knew the dynamic she faced. A black woman in an upscale neighborhood, alone, should always expect this kind of look, this kind of questioning. However, her social position often protected her. She was used to this kind of unjustified distrust, but she never imagined that someone would dare to call her out like this, without a valid reason. Demoted to the image of a simple citizen with a suspicious look, she felt that she had to react without losing her calm. She straightened up, confident and cool. "I'm the Chief Judge of the State Court of Appeals."
"It is my business card."
She held out the card with an ease that betrayed her experience in situations where authority was questioned. But Dupont did not let himself be disarmed. He pushed the card away abruptly, as if his own pride were threatened. "Maybe you're a judge, but you don't belong here. Show me your identification papers too. I don't like surprises." His words were sharp, laced with an arrogance that left little room for discussion. Clarice, shocked by the police officer's insolence, felt a glimmer of incomprehension cross her mind. How could a man be so stubborn in his ignorance and judgment? But she also knew that the situation could get out of hand quickly if she lost her calm. She had observed this kind of scene too often, where reason was drowned in a sea of prejudices. She grabbed her card holder, took a deep breath and, with total control of her emotions, handed him another card, that of his official identity. She engaged in a silent but determined battle, ready to defend herself against this oppressive system that tried to reduce her to a shadow of what she was. But Dupont, blinded by his own certainty of being in the right, did not want to hear anything. He pressed on, scrutinizing every detail, as if looking for a reason to stop her. He looked at the ID card like a detective observing a crime scene, trying to spot an incongruity, a mistake, anything that might validate his prejudice. Clarice knew that her only fault, in this man's mind, was not corresponding to the image he had of the people who belonged to this neighborhood. And this thought pushed him to relentlessness, much more than respect for legal procedures. Clarice remained silent, her mind in turmoil while Dupont continued his absurd inspection. Each second seemed to drag on, heavy, oppressive. It was as if time itself was slowing down in response to the injustice unfolding before his eyes. What should have been a mundane interaction between a citizen and a law enforcement officer turned into a confrontation where their dignity was attacked and their status ignored. She knew that her titles and her role as chief judge, her career and her expertise in law, had no value in the face of a police officer so narrow-minded and so blinded by his prejudices. But there was one thing he didn't know, and that Clarisse never forgot. Her position of power was not based solely on her titles, but on her ability to face injustice with firmness and intelligence. She stood straight, focused, with a cold and calculated serenity. She knew that when faced with this kind of mentality, anger would only make the situation worse. She also knew that in times like this, keeping calm was more powerful than anything. The last word would be hers. She was convinced of it. She just had to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. "You can't do that," she said suddenly, her voice hardening, taking on an authoritative edge that vibrated the air around them. "I'm Chief Justice, and what you're doing here is an abuse of power. You're going to find yourself in trouble." Her words were carefully chosen, delivered with the certainty of a professional who knows the limits of the law, but also with an implicit threat of serious legal consequences. She wasn't trying to shout or get carried away by emotion. She wanted each word to have weight, to be imprinted on Dupont's mind like a promise. Dupont then looked at her, his gaze becoming colder and more calculating. He tried to maintain his superior air, but a hint of doubt crept into his eyes, imperceptible, but undeniably present. The arrogance of his behavior was beginning to waver in the face of Clarisse's calm authority, and he could not ignore the reality of his position. However, before he could react, or even attempt to make a scathing remark to re-establish his control, the sound of an engine echoed through the air. Clarisse turned her head, and her gaze landed on a luxury black car which had just stopped a few meters away. The engine died with a purr, and an imposing figure stepped out. Antoine Delacroix, Attorney General, stepped forward with a confident gait, his piercing gaze immediately fixing the scene. He was Clarisse's close friend, a long-time ally, and he knew exactly what was going on here. Clarisse didn't even need to call him. He knew the stakes of this situation, and he immediately understood the type of abuse she had just suffered. When Dupont saw the prosecutor, he turned pale, his face falling apart with the anguish of realizing that the situation had just changed. The Attorney General, an influential figure in the justice system, was now witness to his abuse of power. And that didn't bode well for him. The chips were down. Clarisse, implacable, turned her head towards Dupont with an icy smile which contrasted profoundly with the situation. She was calm, but her presence exuded a quiet, unstoppable strength. "I am going to file a complaint against you for abuse of power and racial discrimination. You will bitterly regret it."
His words hit Dupont like a silent slap.
He had not anticipated such a reaction, especially from a woman he had thought easy to intimidate, to make bend under the weight of his prejudices and his power. But Clarisse was not that kind of person. She wouldn't let herself be crushed. The policeman remained frozen, his gaze wavering between the prosecutor's car, the professional alliance between him and Clarisse, and the immensity of the error he had just made. He realized that his attempt at domination would only collapse under the weight of the law and principles he was supposed to defend, but which he disregarded in his actions. His posture relaxed slightly, a sign that he knew he had lost this battle, but Dupont's pride was not so easily broken. However, he knew that what he had just done was irreversible. Clarisse, for her part, showed no signs of excessive triumph. She knew that the real victory lay not in the public confrontation of this moment, but in the legal consequences it would provoke. She had faced the abuse of power with dignity, and now the wheels of justice would turn. She waited patiently for Dupont to realize the depth of his mistake. Clarisse's complaint fell like a thunderclap on the police entity, shaking the foundations of the hierarchy which thought it could override its actions without consequences. On Dupont's side, the impact was immediate and devastating. What he considered to be a simple, banal questioning had just transformed into a resounding scandal. He had not measured the scope of his gesture. He had underestimated the strength of a woman he believed to be vulnerable, and worse, he had ignored the weight of his actions as a representative of authority. By attacking Clarisse, he had not only humiliated a citizen, he had attacked one of the pillars of justice itself.